Hello and welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our researcher David Hearne. So David, the last couple of days have been really interesting, following off of Boris Johnson's speech on Sunday night about the new phase of lockdown. So here in England, we've had a few adjustments to the measures, but it's still been quite a confusing time understanding the lockdown roadmap. Well, that's what he's calling it. Now, of course, the measures in England have changed somewhat. But the rest of the UK are wanting to stay put with the stay-at-home message. What do you think this says about Boris Johnson's leadership?
I mean, first of all, it appears to me that the devolved governments were not consulted, certainly not in a huge, certainly not with much by way of notice anyway, over the change in messaging. So I think it's important to point out that England really is the one out of step here. Everywhere else in the UK has opted to continue with the original messaging, the stay home messaging. That's true of Northern Ireland and Wales, as well as in Scotland. So I think there's really, it's difficult to understand what in England is so very different. I know there have been various articles where people have speculated about the value of R, and what's the infection rate like? Is it somewhat higher in some of the devolved nations? Given the level of uncertainty over what the infection rate is anyway, I don't really buy that. It strikes me as reasonably implausible. In any event, England is quite a large place. I don't mean geographically, but in terms of its population, it's certainly large compared to the other nations of the UK. So it seems odd that you'd argue that something would be applicable for 55 million of the 65 million of us living in the UK. And yet, each of the other constituent nations of the United Kingdom things would be totally different. I mean, you can imagine a situation where, for example, the situation in, let's say, the West Midlands is different from that in Yorkshire. And if it makes sense on the basis of the science to apply different measures in Scotland, then surely it would make sense to do so on a disaggregated level within England. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all to me that we've got this one-size-fits-all approach to the entirety of England. I mean, you can take that one step further and say, okay, well, why on earth did we not impose different measures in London versus, let's take Yorkshire as an example, in the beginning of all of this? And the kind of reasoning given at the time was because people could move outside of London, because what you didn't want is a situation where you announced a lockdown for London but not for Yorkshire. And if you were going to try and test, trace and treat in one part of the UK whilst imposing a stringent lockdown on another part of the UK, the idea was that people would move to escape the lockdown. We saw that in Italy, where lockdowns were imposed in certain parts of certain northern regions before they were imposed on the rest of the country. But if that's true, then it's difficult to see the rationale for these measures, and it appears to be very much England that has moved out of lockstep with the rest of the UK, not the other way around. So what is it that's so exceptional about England? I really don't know. It's difficult to understand the rationale behind that. So I would imagine that it would make more sense to consult more widely and to try and move at a pace which everyone was entirely happy with. The second point I'd make with regard to that is a lot of what's changed in that regard is the messaging. So stay home is very, very clear messaging. It's very, very clear. There's a huge clarity involved there. Stay alert is not. I'm alert about many things in life. Every time I get in a car, I try and stay alert. Generally, falling asleep at the wheel is not a good thing. Stay alert, what does that mean? And I know we've had clarification, and I know that we've had, Johnson and various advisors saying, actually, we're treating the British public like they're intelligent, etc., and they can make up, they can understand that, but actually, stay home is a very, very clear piece of messaging, very, very obvious what you're being asked to do, and very, very clear what is expected. Stay alert is not, and the new situation is not clear. There are various grey areas that have sort of emerged, and there's a huge uncertainty for people in border regions of the UK. Now, this is less applicable to Northern Ireland, at least as regards the rest of the UK. But, if you live on the Welsh border or near the Welsh border, or indeed the Scottish border, then you're going to have a hard time fully understanding which set of guidance you should be following and how best to do that. It is clear up to a point that the law in Wales applies in Wales, and it applies the moment that you cross that border. But if you are living, let's say somewhere in Shropshire, and you are supposed to work on the other side of the Welsh border, or indeed vice versa. So let's say you're in Paris, for example, you face a difficult situation where you are you expected to commute to work because the British government is telling you one thing, and your employer is responding to that as they're based in England, but your own government is telling you something quite different, and it's very, very difficult to see how one gets around that grey area, and it's not something that we've had to deal with in the UK in the past. So there are real difficulties raised there.
So another thing we have learned over the past few days is that passengers arriving from France and the Republic of Ireland will be exempt from forthcoming UK coronavirus quarantine measures. But can we expect other countries to be added to this list in the next week or so, maybe in the next month? And why are these certain countries exempt as well?
Again, one has to question some of, not all of, but some of the logic behind that. With regard to Ireland, that perhaps makes more sense. Ireland shares a land border, as we famously know after Brexit, with the UK. It's the only country to share a land border with the UK. And actually, it makes a great deal of sense that we don't try and police that border. And therefore, it makes sense that Irish travellers would be exempt from those rules, certainly as regards going to Northern Ireland. In terms of the rest of the UK, or Great Britain to be precise, well, again, there's some logic to that lying around the common travel area and around, actually, if you're able to move within the UK from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, then it doesn't make much sense to try and quarantine those moving from Ireland to Britain. Otherwise, you'll end up with people going from Dublin to Belfast, and then from Belfast to Great Britain. So in terms of dealing with that, that makes a degree of sense. France, rather less so. I believe the logic here is basically that it's reciprocal. The French agreed not to impose quarantine on British travellers. So in France, there's a quarantine imposed, 14-day quarantine imposed on international arrivals. It does not apply to those coming from elsewhere in the Schengen zone, and it does not apply to Great Britain. So I suspect there's a degree of reciprocity there, that the UK is not imposing a quarantine, and in exchange for, the quid pro quo is that France doesn't either. And that makes some sense, not much sense, but some sense with regard to the Eurostar. It seems daft that if you get on the Eurostar Amsterdam, you would somehow have a quarantine imposed, or you fly from the Netherlands, you have a quarantine imposed. But if you drive from the Netherlands to France and then get on the Eurostar in Paris, even though you're Dutch, you don't get quarantined. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. I would imagine and hope that the lack of logic inherent in that would would start to be dealt with perhaps by expanding freer travel to the entire, well, the rest of Europe, or certainly the EU. Difficult to say though, isn't it? It would there'd also be a logic to imposing less quarantine on countries that have a low rate of very low infection rates, very low rate of transmission of the virus. So you'd look to, for example, to have less quarantine on places like New Zealand. I can't imagine people travelling from New Zealand to the UK, and in any event you'd need to transit, so it doesn't have any practical bearing. But that's an example of a country where actually transmission rates are exceptionally low. We might get to a point where that's true of, let's say, Germany as well, in which case you'd hope and expect that quarantine measures would be lifted, or at least applied less stringently to travellers from those destinations. But that would depend also on the policies of those countries. So we'll have to see. I think this is a fast evolving situation, and you'd hope and expect that there'd be a degree of international cooperation there.
So in Brexit news, talks between the UK and EU over a post-Brexit trade deal are now in their third round, but the EU have accused the UK of concentrating on its priorities whilst going slow on issues which are important to the 27-member bloc. Do you think these ongoing disagreements and slow progress could eventually lead us towards a no-deal Brexit then? Yeah,
they could. I mean, equally, let's be pragmatic. Countries concentrate on what's important to them. That's not really surprising. That's what I would expect. That's what you would hope from trade negotiators. You know, if I were in the European Union, if I were a German businessman, for example, I would hope and expect and want the EU to be concentrating on my priorities. If I were a Spanish fisherman, I would want the EU to be pushing very, very hard for access to British waters, for example. Equally, as a citizen of the UK, you'd hope that the government would push issues that are of importance to me. So I'm not sure how much water that holds. I suppose the only thing you might say is that actually all of these things involve a quid pro quo, right? They're trade-offs. That's the entire point of trade negotiations. You give me something, I give you something. You know, we can arrive at an area where everybody benefits. You know, you allow me some kind of, you know, let's say, for example, passporting rights, or you agree not to impose tariffs on agricultural products, or whatever the issue might be, and in exchange, I'll let you fish in my waters. You know, this is, you know, fishing is from a strictly economic perspective, fishing is a really easy giveaway from the UK. It amounts to a tiny, vanishingly small percentage of GDP. There are very, very, very few people employed directly in fishing. Obviously, it's of huge importance to those communities where most people are employed in fishing. But let's be realistic here. This is not a large number of people. We're not talking about manufacturing, for example, where you've got over 2 million. We're not talking about the retail supply chain. We're not even talking about haulage. We're talking about an industry that is of very, very modest economic importance, is an easy giveaway economically. And, you know, you'd hope that you'd get something significant in exchange. The problem is that it's a very difficult giveaway politically. That's true for both sides. So the EU has huge pressure on it. You know, the EU actually are very, very aware of how tense the political situation is. You know, these guys aren't stupid. What they need is something to be able to say to member states, and to be able to say to fishing lobby groups, we're making some progress. They don't need to have a complete agreement by July. They need to be able to say we are making some progress. Otherwise, you'll end up with a situation where, you know, people try and take things into their own hands, and nobody wants that. So I can see where both sides are coming from here, but ultimately you'd hope that this can be resolved. It shouldn't be insoluble. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of humankind to solve this issue. And yes, it does make a no-deal Brexit more likely. ultimately that can easily be avoided if the UK government wants to avoid it. The only question is whether the UK government wants to avoid it. And you know, if you're going to play a game of chicken, that's perhaps quite a dangerous game to play.
Thanks for joining me, David.
All right, thank you very much.